ranking 7 different versions of Catwoman. You can't step into a movie theater or turn on a streaming service without coming face to face with a comic book character. Whether they're a superhero or a villain, everybody seems to be getting their own movie or TV show, and for many, it isn't their first, and for some, it isn't even their second. Although Marvel has reigned supreme over the box office this past decade, that hasn't stopped other comic book companies from trying to get a slice of that multi-billion-dollar pie, with the DC Extended Universe coming the closest to the MCU's level of success. Ironically enough, DC Comics is often reproached for seemingly hopping onto the superhero movie craze after Marvel, when it should really be the other way around, considering DC was the first company to bring their characters to the silver screen. With Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman on their roster, DC has some of the most recognizable superheroes in history, as well as some of the most iconic villains. Aside from Harley Quinn and the Joker, the company's most memorable villain is probably Catwoman, who has appeared in several film and TV adaptations since she was first introduced. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at 7 different versions of Catwoman, from her first appearance in the Batman series from the 1960s all the way to 2022's grungy Batman. We'll be ranking the character based off of 2 factors. The first, her role in the story. The second, her outfit. Because duh. My apologies if I wasn't able to mention your favorite iteration of the character. She's made a lot of appearances over the years, and for the sake of this video, and my own sanity, I wanted to focus on her most memorable moments. Let's get into it.
Meow.
Selina Kyle was introduced in the debut issue of Batman, which was released on April 24th, 1940, making her one of the first characters to appear in the popular series. Then known only as the Cat, she was a whip-carrying burglar and master of disguise who both attracted and antagonized Batman. According to Batman co-creator Bob Kane, the character's persona and appearance was inspired by famous actresses like Jean Harlow and Hedy Lamarr, who helped introduce the femme fatale archetype, and Catwoman would go on to play a similar role in the series and in future on-screen adaptations. Besides bringing some much-needed sex appeal to the comics, Catwoman was also a stark contrast to the rest of Gotham's villains, as she was never outright evil, highlighting a sense of moral ambiguity that was similarly present in Bruce Wayne. Her cat imagery came about because Bob Kane and Bill Finger saw the animal as the antithesis of bats, with Bob Kane even saying, quote, "I felt that women were feline creatures and men were more like dogs. While dogs are faithful and friendly, cats are cool, detached, and unreliable. Cats are as hard to understand as women are." This sentiment mirrors Bruce Wayne's relationship with Selina Kyle, finding himself utterly unable to understand her, but being intrigued nevertheless. Selina's backstory is purposely left vague early on, with this ambiguity playing into the mysterious nature of cats themselves, and her character's reasons for joining a life of crime aren't fully fleshed out until much later. In her earliest comic appearances, Selina didn't have an official costume, but by the 3rd issue of Batman, she began to make the transformation from the Cat to Catwoman, wearing a furry feline mask as part of her villainous disguise. She wore this bizarre mask, a dress, and a cape in various colors throughout the early 1940s, but in 1946 her character had yet another wardrobe change, appearing in a cat-eared cowl that was similar to Batman's. The silhouette of her dress and her color scheme was experimented with in several issues, before finally settling on this fairly conservative green and purple ensemble in 1947. She would go on to wear this outfit until the character's decade-long hiatus in 1954, which was prompted by the creation of the Comics Code Authority, which sought to censor the comic industry, specifically how female characters were depicted. Because of these restrictions, DC focused on creating more blatantly heroic characters, with Wonder Woman and Batwoman dominating the majority of female-led storylines in the comics during this time period. After over a decade, Catwoman finally reappeared in a March 1966 episode of the popular live-action Batman TV series, serving as a romantic interest for Adam West's Batman. Played by Julie Newmar, this marked the first appearance of her now iconic catsuit, which was reminiscent of the outfit worn by the character of Emma Peel in the popular British espionage series The Avengers. Newmar is credited for modifying the Catwoman costume so the gold belt was placed at her hips instead of the waist, helping to emphasize her hourglass figure, and this became a wardrobe mainstay for this version of the character. This costume was incredibly different from that of her comic book counterpart, with a pair of cat ears and a mask instead of the face-covering cowl, and of course, a skin-tight silhouette instead of a conservative dress. Equal parts sexy and silly, this iteration of Catwoman quickly became a fan favorite, and the rise in interest led to her eventual comic book return in November 1966. In this appearance in Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, Catwoman now wore an ensemble that was an amalgamation of her previous comic book look combined with the catsuit that had been popularized in the Batman TV show. With Julie Newmar unable to appear in the 1966 Batman film, the character was played by Lee Merriweather, which, funnily enough, was only the first unexplained recasting in this Batman universe. For the third and final season of the show, which aired in 1967, Catwoman was played by Eartha Kitt, and would become one of the actress's best remembered roles, to the point that you wouldn't even realize that she only ever appeared in 5 episodes.
Hello, Pierre. This is Catwoman.
Batman associate producer Charles Fitzsimmons said about her casting, quote, "We felt it was a very provocative idea. She was a Catwoman before we ever cast her as Catwoman. She had a cat-like style, her eyes were cat-like, and her singing was like a meow." Kitt's characterization of Catwoman was distinctly different from Julie Newmar's, being more sassy than sexy, giving the character a strength and mischievousness that had yet to be explored. While this can be credited to Kitt's acting style, it also pointed to an issue that plagued Hollywood and the rest of the United States. Interracial relationships were still considered taboo at this time, and the usual sexual tension between Catwoman and Batman was dramatically reduced compared to earlier seasons of the show in order to appease audiences. Because Catwoman was now played by a black woman, while Batman continued to be played by a white actor, the character was sadly no longer able to fill a romantic role. But on the bright side, this meant that she was able to evolve from femme fatale to formidable villain. Besides helping develop the character's unique personality, Eartha Kitt's time as Catwoman is remembered as being an important turning point in television history. In the 1960s, black women were rarely given starring roles, and the success of Kitt's performance showed that the status quo was changing. While it's upsetting that the character was no longer able to be seen as a romantic interest, Catwoman's personification openly defied stereotypes about black women, and was a character who was openly acknowledged for being beautiful and feminine during a time period when whiteness was the beauty standard. According to Eartha Kitt's daughter, Kit Shapiro, quote, "She knew the importance of the role and she was proud of it. She really is a part of history. She was one of the first really beautiful black women who were allowed to be sexy without being stereotyped. It does take a village, but I do think she helped blaze a trail." Because this Batman series focused on gags as opposed to actually building lore and developing the characters, Catwoman's backstory in the series is essentially non-existent, and you could argue that the only reason we still talk about this version of the character today is because of Eartha Kitt. While the Batman series and comics of the 1960s had a distinctly colorful and camp aesthetic, the 1980s marked a return to a darker formula, which was solidified by the success of Tim Burton's Gothic Batman film in 1989. As both a hero and a villain, Catwoman was multidimensional in a way that many female characters of the time weren't, and Selina Kyle was a highly sought-after role for both up-and-coming actors and veterans in the industry. This version of Catwoman departs heavily from the comic series canon, with Selina Kyle starting off as a mousy secretary who was murdered by her evil boss before being revived by a group of cats and being reborn as the more confident, yet unhinged, Catwoman. Although the character had been introduced in the comics as a burglar, there's no reference to this in the film, and she only pursues a life of crime in response to being mistreated by others, even acting as a vigilante of sorts, at least in the beginning. As Selina Kyle, she enters a romantic relationship with Bruce Wayne, and their alter egos participate in a similar flirtation, creating a complicated dynamic that outshines every previous iteration of their romance.
Mistletoe can be deadly if you eat it.
But a kiss can be even deadlier if you mean it.
You know, mistletoe can be deadly if you eat it.
A kiss can be even deadlier if you mean it.
Catwoman's sexuality and femininity had always been a large part of the character, but in this film it was taken to the next level and actually incorporated into the story in a meaningful way. She lulls other characters into a false sense of security by having them underestimate her because she's a woman, while simultaneously using her sexuality to manipulate them, allowing her to regularly get the upper hand.
How could you? I'm a woman.
I'm sorry,
While there's no denying that she's hypersexualized, it doesn't feel as male-gazy as, say, 2016's Harley Quinn in Suicide Squad. And the characters who refuse to view her as anything aside from a sexual conquest come to regret it. This version of the character is athletic and acrobatic, truly seeming like a cat stuck in a human's body. But she isn't foolish enough to go out without a weapon. Much like Batman's utility belt, her whip serves multiple purposes, even functioning as a means of transportation, and this alludes to her comic book counterpart. Despite being a part of her characterization since the very beginning, this remains the only live-action version of Catwoman to focus on her abilities as a whip-wielding badass, with the majority only featuring the weapon as an afterthought. Visually, this is one of the most unique Catwomen, with the inspiration behind the look often being attributed to her characterization in the Batman Year One comics. Now a sex worker, Selina Kyle wears a leather bustier with matching pants, and as Catwoman she dons a full feline suit, complete with a tail and whiskers. Batman Returns simplifies that catsuit and adds elements that are commonly associated with sex work and fetish wear. Her black latex suit is shiny and skin-tight, making the character look as though she's been dipped in oil, something that's fluid and flammable, which mirrors her fiery personality. Another interesting design element was the addition of white stitches, which gave the outfit much-needed dimension and sold the idea that it was homemade, something that isn't often present in superhero films. This haphazard stitching was also symbolic of the character's psychological state, implying that she too was coming apart at the seams and was at risk of breaking at any moment. The character's mask is also taken to the extreme, fully embracing the feline imagery and being a rare example of a successful disguise. The costume in this film wound up influencing her design in following comics and animation, with Catwoman's appearance in 1992's Batman the Animated Series featuring a catsuit that was equal parts Michelle Pfeiffer and Julie Newmar. While it's undeniable that she looked amazing, Michelle Pfeiffer has since called the costume the most uncomfortable thing she's ever worn, saying in an interview, quote, "They had to powder me down, help me inside, and then vacuum pack the suit. They'd paint it with a silicone-based finish to give it its trademark shine. I had those claws, and I was always catching them in things. The face mask was smashing my face and choking me." Brilliantly written and directed, this version of Catwoman is nuanced in a way that is still hard to come by, making her one of the best anti-heroes of all time. Earning Halle Berry a Golden Raspberry Award for Worst Actress, 2004's Catwoman is one of the most contentious comic book adaptations ever. For the most part, audiences seem to enjoy Halle Berry's take on the catty character, especially from a visual standpoint. But other aspects of the film, like its tone and deviation from the source material, were some of the biggest complaints. With no references to Batman or Gotham, many have called the film Catwoman in name only. Instead of revolving around Selina Kyle, the movie invented a new character in an attempt to push the idea that anyone could become Catwoman, something I personally attribute to the popularity of Spider-Man, which had a somewhat similar message. Like Selina Kyle in 1992's Batman Returns, Patience starts off as a meek version of herself that is eventually reincarnated by cats, giving her heightened senses and a confidence boost. Now a vigilante/detective who is attempting to discover why she was murdered, the character is less morally ambiguous, coming across as a generic hero instead of an anti-hero.
You see, sometimes I'm good. Oh, I'm very good. But sometimes I'm bad. But only as bad as I want to be.
Unlike most versions of Catwoman, which were rooted in reality, Olympic-level gymnastic abilities were no longer enough, and she was now basically superhuman, jumping off of skyscrapers, climbing walls, and running on all fours, something that was achieved through an excessive amount of CGI. In a review by Roger Ebert, he described Catwoman as, quote, "a movie about Halle Berry's beauty, sex appeal, figure, eyes, lips, and costume design." And I'm inclined to agree. Unlike Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman, whose sexuality served a purpose in the story, this version is sexy just for the hell of it. Besides the camera lingering on Halle Berry's body far more times than necessary, her clothing is incredibly impractical, and even her fighting style comes across as sexual instead of powerful. The film attempts to present the sexuality as empowering and freeing, but that message is lost when other women in the film are framed as desperate or pathetic for expressing their own sexuality. It's also important to keep in mind that the villain in this film is a woman who is afraid of aging. Now, this could have been interesting if they delved into why someone might be fearful of growing older in a society where beauty is commodified, and why there are different expectations for men versus women, but instead it seems like she's just mad that younger women exist.
Quit the self-tanning. Stop eating Viagra like they're vitamins. Resist the urge to date children born the same day they invented the cell phone.
I'm sorry. I'm forgetting my manners. Can I offer you something? Can of tuna, saucer of milk. I'm a woman, Lone. I'm used to doing all kinds of things I don't want to do.
This version of Catwoman shows the most skin out of the bunch, with the character wearing a cropped bustier, ripped low-rise pants, opera-length gloves, and a cat mask. It's undoubtedly a product of its time, looking like something you'd spot in a Christina Aguilera music video. And without the mask, it'd be near impossible to identify the character. The director of the film said of the outfit, quote, "It has elements of previous cat suits, but it is so unique to Halle, to her shape and beauty. It shows a lot of skin, but also has a warrior-like quality to it. When she wears it, it looks like somebody who's ready for a fight. I personally think she looks ready for the club." Obviously, Halle Berry looks amazing, but she's one of those people who could wear a potato sack and still look gorgeous. I will give it points for being a unique interpretation of Catwoman's outfit, even if it doesn't make any sense. Now, you can say what you want about the film's quality, but I think it's important to acknowledge that this is still the only mainstream superhero film that's focused on a woman of color, making it, in a sense, ahead of its time. And while the film might not have been well received, if there's even one girl out there who was able to see herself represented in a way she hadn't before, then it was worth making. Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy is a realistic imagining of the Batman story, and we see Catwoman finally return to her criminal roots, with the character working as a jewel thief and con artist in Gotham. Like this version of Batman, Catwoman uses technology and martial arts, an update that brings the character into the modern age and makes her less unexplainably powerful. In the film, Selina is a hardened criminal with a rap sheet a mile long. Hoping to get her record wiped, she begins working for other criminals, only to be double-crossed at the last minute. Bruce Wayne offers to help her, and she assists him with his investigation, but betrays him, something she eventually regrets. With Gotham set to explode, she begs Bruce to escape with her, but he declines, prompting a change of heart on her end. They both fight to save the city, and it's eventually revealed that the two have entered an official relationship. While moral ambiguity was always a mainstay of the character, it's even more so in this version. She's unashamed of the fact that she has to commit crimes in order to survive, but she still has a clear line that she refuses to cross, even if it isn't necessarily in her best interests. Bruce is intrigued and impressed by Selina, breathing a new life into the Bat and the Cat romance, and her characterization departs from the classic femme fatale archetype that Catwoman has historically fallen under, which allows the two of them to accept each other as equals.
Look, you wouldn't beat up a woman any more than I would beat up a cripple. Of course, sometimes exceptions have to be made.
Confident, cunning, and just a bit cynical, this interpretation of Selina Kyle highlights how much things have changed since the character was first introduced in the 1940s. Back then, women in comics were mere love interests and sex objects who weren't even given their own backstories, but now they're being given the attention they rightly deserve. Considering how the functionality of the bat suit wound up affecting how it looked in various films, it wouldn't be a stretch to say the same about Catwoman's ensemble. Visually, it's most similar to the catsuit of the 1960s, but Anne Hathaway's outfit features more practical elements, including a utility belt and safe-cracking goggles that give the character cat ears, a design element that is repeated at other points in the film, which I thought was quite clever. Perhaps the only thing that makes it glaringly obvious that a man was in charge of the look are her stiletto boots, giving her the highest heels of any Catwoman so far. Some complaints about this version of Catwoman were directed towards the lack of cat tendencies that were present in Eartha Kitt, Michelle Pfeiffer, and Halle Berry's depictions, something that I think is a rather bizarre criticism. The character's moniker is derived from her profession as a cat burglar, not because she actually acted like a cat.
Oops.
This series depicts the origins of Batman and follows the character and his most famous foes in their youth. Introduced in the pilot episode, Selina Kyle is a teenage orphan who eventually befriends Bruce Wayne, promising to help him on his quest for vengeance, and the two begin to fall in love. As a teenager, the character is understandably more emotional than other iterations, and as a result finds herself struggling between what is right and wrong. Because she's a kid for the majority of the series, her disguise is appropriately conservative and by far the most practical. Working as a thief, she wears clothing that is inconspicuous and comfortable, donning a leather biker jacket, ripped jeans, knee-high boots, fingerless biker gloves, a hoodie, and steampunk-style goggles. There's nothing distinctly cat-like about the outfit, which I think is a missed opportunity considering a teenager is the perfect character to have experiment with kooky fashion. I think a hoodie with cat ears could have been a totally appropriate choice, or maybe even a stylized choker so it looked like she had a cat collar. At the end of the series, we see an older version of the character after she officially becomes Catwoman, and she wears a form-fitting black catsuit with a hooded mask, which winds up making her look like a less polished version of Anne Hathaway's Catwoman. Spoiler warning for this one. The latest Catwoman to grace the silver screen, Selina Kyle is now played by Zoe Kravitz. A neo-noir thriller, the film follows early versions of both Batman and Catwoman, with both characters having yet to fully embrace and understand their alter egos and themselves. Like many interpretations of Catwoman, she's an orphan in this film, which has led to her developing a thick skin and a grim outlook on life. Unbeknownst to her, she's the daughter of mob boss Carmine Falcone, who's to blame for many of the problems plaguing Gotham and the death of her mother years earlier. Working as a nightclub waitress and cat burglar, she eventually teams up with Batman after the disappearance of her friend. While Bruce's view of good versus evil is black and white, Selina's is more nuanced, making the two characters direct foils of one another. Like Anne Hathaway in The Dark Knight Rises, she similarly tries to leave town in order to save herself, but chooses to go back after being inspired by Batman's self-sacrificial nature. She does eventually leave town for good, but we can assume that it isn't the last we've seen of her. I'm probably in the minority here, but I didn't buy the romance between Catwoman and Batman in this film. Hollywood needs to understand that just because two people are hot doesn't necessarily mean they have chemistry. Not only does their romance come out of nowhere, but it feels pretty awkward. Firstly, because Bruce in this film is a bit socially inept, but also because the delivery of their banter regularly falls flat.
You got a lot of cats.
I have a thing about strays.
Boy, you're a real sweetheart. You really don't care what happens to me in there tonight, do you?
Don't throw your life away.
Don't worry, honey. I got 9 of them.
Dangerous crowd you're stealing from.
Jesus. This how you get your kicks, hun? Sneaking up on girls in the dark? Why don't you come with me? Get into some trouble. Knock off some CEO hedge fund types. It'll be fun.
They're also missing the balance between friend and foe that is crucial to their flirtation. Although she and Batman have traditionally been romantically involved, I don't think it was necessary for this specific story, to the extent that if they were simply friends, nothing about the plot would actually have to change. I personally think this could have been the perfect time to display platonic love instead of romantic love, and maybe then Selina's queerness could have been more than implied. We see a return to cat-like mannerisms with this version of Selina Kyle, with the character slinking and sauntering about in a way that is reminiscent of Halle Berry's Catwoman, albeit less cringy. Sullen yet sensual, Selina comes across as the stereotypical cool girl, which is further exemplified by her clothing choices.
I can take care of myself.
A combination of rock star and biker, she often wears tough leather combined with soft basics, symbolizing the character's duality. Sporting different wigs throughout the film, we can see that the character is uncomfortable with who she is and is desperately seeking whatever escape she can find, even if it's only temporary and physical. The character's leather catsuit is fairly simple, providing ample room for evolution in the future, although I will admit that it looks incredibly similar to the outfit in The Dark Knight Rises. While the catsuit itself looks fine, I cannot stand the mask the character wears, Besides looking like an oversized sock, it doesn't actually work as a functional disguise. Obviously, they were trying to make it look homemade, but I think they went too far. Considering the rest of the look, I think a black helmet with ears could have been more practical and significantly less goofy. The character's long, cat-like nails, which were Zoe Kravitz's idea, are a unique choice, but it did leave me thinking that she probably wouldn't actually be that helpful in a fight, as if her small stature wasn't already making that unbelievable enough. Now that we've gone through all 7 versions of live-action Catwomen, let's get into the rankings, starting from the worst and ending with the best. This is going to be heavily biased, so don't take it too seriously if your favorite isn't mine. Gotham. While she's an incredibly prominent character in the series, there's nothing about this version of Selina Kyle that hasn't been seen in other adaptations, and those didn't have half as much screen time. Not to mention the fact that her outfits, both as a teen and an adult, are boring at best. Batman. Yes, she's the original, but I'm afraid she just doesn't make that much of an impact in the grand scheme of things. Nothing more than eye candy and a punchline, this version of Selina Kyle is the furthest thing from a threat. Obviously, I appreciate that this introduced the catsuit to the character's design, but we would have gotten there eventually. Catwoman. This is one of those it's so bad it's kind of good movies, so it's definitely worth a rewatch if you haven't seen it in a while. I actually like the idea that anyone could become Catwoman, but it wasn't utilized properly in the film, and as such their deviation from the source material just seems unnecessary. I like that her outfit is a little 2000s time capsule, and that it's actually pretty unique overall. Also, Halle Berry and Sharon Stone look amazing in this movie. The Batman. Keep in mind that this isn't a ranking of the films themselves, because The Batman would definitely be scoring higher if that were the case. But I think that Catwoman isn't as fleshed out as I'd like her to be, especially considering the versions that have come before her. I appreciate that more of the character's backstory is revealed, but during the film it just kind of feels like she's around for the ride and spends most of her time brooding prettily. I also can't forgive them for that mask. Batman. I prefer Eartha's take on the character to Julie's. It's more over the top and camp, which fits the tone of the series, and having the character evolve from a floozy to a foe was much needed. Eartha's characterization wound up being so influential on the character that elements of it are still present today, and considering she was only in 5 episodes, that's all the more impressive. The Dark Knight Rises. Anne Hathaway does a phenomenal job with this character, being able to express layered emotions in even the simplest moments. Regularly prioritizing herself, her role in the story is bigger than being Batman's lover or sidekick, which is more than we could say for some of the other Catwomen. As for the catsuit, I think it looks fantastic, equal parts functional and fashionable. It definitely feels like something a Gotham City cat burglar would wear. Batman Returns. Does this come as a surprise to anyone? I'll admit that I'm a bit biased considering this is the Catwoman I grew up watching, but I really do think it's one of the best depictions of the character to date. Her evolution over the course of the film is interesting and her motivations are fully fleshed out. Plus, the complex relationship between Selina Kyle and Bruce Wayne versus Catwoman and Batman is amazing to watch. As for her outfit, it not only looks great, but it makes perfect sense for the character, which is something more adaptations need to be conscious of. From femme fatale to friendly foe to feminist icon, it's remarkable to see how Catwoman has evolved over the last 80 years, and I for one can't wait to see what's next. Which version of Catwoman is your favorite, and what would you like to see us rank next? I hope you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!